motion or a discussion about the approval for the minutes from our past meeting, which is on October 30th of 2019. Is there any discussion or any?
Make a motion to approve.
All right, we've got a motion to approve. Do we have a second? Second. All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Thank you. With that, we'll go ahead and turn the time over to David Church, who's here to provide us some much-needed training. So thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
No problem. I'm assuming that this is a good enough place to stand, that everybody can hear me. Let me say, oh, thank you. I appreciate the invitation. I actually do a lot of these trainings for various cities around, so I don't mind doing it all. It's not a bother. I don't know why people ask me, other than they're tired of listening to their own in-house people, but I don't know if it's even entertaining anymore. I've been asked to do your mandatory annual training on the Open Public Meetings Act. As all the members of the Planning Commission and the City Council are probably aware, unless some of you are new, the Utah Open and Public Meetings Act actually has a provision in it that the legislature put in some few years ago now that requires that the chair of any public body provide annual training to its members on compliance with the Open Public Meetings Act. Frankly, the legislature put that in aimed at municipalities and counties because there were feelings among some interest groups, members of the public, in that we were cheating, that we were making decisions outside the open public meetings. So that section was not put in because the legislature thought they needed to be trained or that school boards needed to be trained. It was actually aimed at municipalities and counties, and it was aimed at us because we make decisions that deal with people's personal property. We make decisions that deal with large developments that excite lots of public fervor, public clamor. We make decisions that sometimes are controversial, and there were feelings among people that those decisions were being made behind closed doors. And so the legislature put that in the act, and then they also have it set up such that the state auditor, as part of their rules, what the independent auditors are required to audit, audits that part as the performance. So I was at a city council meeting 2 or 3 weeks ago when they were receiving their annual report from the state auditor, and there was a finding from not the state auditor, but their independent auditor. There was a finding in that meeting. One of their non-compliance was they could not prove that one council member had been trained that year in the Open Public Meetings Act. So that's how important they think it is that you get training. Whether the training's effective or not, I don't know, but we can prove that you're trained at least, and we keep a record of that. The reason why compliance with the Open Public Meetings Act is important in my mind is this, and I think we should start with that as to why we even worry about it, why we need to train, is, in my experience, first, it builds trust. It builds trust in our constituents, it builds trust in the public, it builds trust in the media, which translates to trust in the public. The best example I can think of the mistrust, and one of the reasons to do it is the recent example that the state legislature set for us with this tax reform. The feeling was that those public meetings that they went around the state were nothing more than a show, that the real decision had already been made in the closed-door caucuses, and that the public process was nothing more than decoration, that the public input didn't matter, that it wasn't a transparent process, that the deliberations and the decisions had taken place either in a very small room with 6 people or a larger room with the Republican caucus, but it had already been decided. That's an example to us of why it's important to comply with the Open Public Meetings Act. If we want to avoid that mistrust on tough decisions, if we want to avoid having to have referendums filed and then a quick repeal of decisions, one of the ways to do that is to make those decisions in public in compliance with the Open and Public Meetings Act. And in fact, the policy in the act is clear. The legislature put in the act that it is the policy of the state of Utah. It says the legislature finds and declares that the state, its agencies, and political subdivisions exist to aid in the conduct of the people's business. It is the intent of the legislature that the state, its agencies, and its political subdivisions take their actions openly and conduct their deliberations openly. Now, that policy statement is what guides anybody that's interpreting the Open and Public Meetings Act. Any part of the act that may be confusing or may need interpretation or that may seem to conflict with other things, and if a court is asked to interpret it, they start first with, well, we're going to interpret it to carry out the policy. And the policy is clear that we take our actions openly, and it defines those as two things. One is we take our actions openly. That's often shorthanded as you make your decisions in public. And the second is the more difficult, that you conduct your deliberations openly. And that's a more difficult kind of thing. So let's talk about those things when we get there. But first, number one issue is, who does the act apply to? It applies, there's one act for the whole state, for all things. It applies to all public bodies. And the act defines public body. A public body is any body that consists of more than two people, that is created by ordinance, resolution, constitution, statute, some kind of official creation, that is supported by public funds and has some authority to do the public's business. So obviously your city council is a public body. It's created by statute, consists of more than two people, supported by public money. You have authority to do public's business. The planning commission is a public body for the same thing. Likewise, any body or committee, any group that you create by resolution, ordinance, officially give them some duty, support them with public money, will be a public body that has to comply with the Open and Public Meetings Act. So if you have a town days committee that's officially created and ongoing, it's a public body and has to comply. If you have a subcommittee of your city council and staff members, say Economic Development Committee, and you officially create that, give them some kind of duty, support it with public money, it's a public body. If you have a history committee that's supported by public funds and officially created by some kind of official thing that you do, it's a public body. All meetings of these public bodies are required to comply with the Open and Public Meetings Act. Meeting is a defined term in the Act. A meeting is defined as the convening of a public body for the purposes of which the public body is created, at which a quorum of the public body is present. And then you have a negative definition. A meeting is not a purely social occasion or a chance get-together. Convening is a defined term in the Open and Public Meetings Act. Convening means that whoever's got the authority to call a public body together calls it together. You're convened by thing. With the Planning Commission, you have a system. How do you convene a meeting? Chair might call a meeting. City Council, you're convened by the mayor, or any two members of the City Council has authority under the state statute to call a special meeting of the City Council. You have a regular meeting schedule. That's clearly the convening of a public body. You might have a special meeting to call. That's clearly the convening of a public body. If you all show up together at the Herriman High School football game, you haven't been convened. You weren't called together by your public body. It may be a chance get-together. It may be on purpose. It may be a social occasion, but you're not convened. So you need, first, a public body. You need to be convened for that purposes. And then if you have a quorum present, you're doing the purpose of the public body. It is a meeting for purposes of the Open and Public Meetings Act. Now, The Act clearly says it doesn't matter what you call the meeting. If you could call it a work session, you can call it an executive session, you can call it anything you want. The name does not matter. It also doesn't matter how you convene. You can convene telephonically. You convene electronically. You can convene by Skype, in theory. What matters is that you've convened as a public body, that someone has called the meeting, and that you've got a quorum present and you're functioning as that body. If you're convened in a meeting as a public body, the law requires that that meeting be open to the public. And that's 100% of all those meetings. There is no way you can convene a meeting that doesn't start as an open and public meeting and still be in compliance with the law. Fortunately, it's easy to comply if you want to comply. All the Open Meetings Act requires is that you have an appropriate notice of the meeting, done at least 24 hours before the meeting, posted at the place of the meeting, posted on the state public notice website, and a copy of that notice sent to whatever news media is giving you a request or an interest to have a copy of that. There's no requirement you publish it. You're encouraged to put it on your own website, and perhaps in the future that'll be a requirement, but you must put it on the state public notice website. You must post it at the place of the meeting. You must send it out to at least to the one media representative. 24 hours before, the notice has to have date, time, and place of the meeting. It should include an agenda of the things that you intend to discuss and decide, and the law requires that that be with enough specificity that someone who reads it can figure out what you're trying to do. So, for example, there are court cases that say changing R1 zone to R2 zone in the South 40 may not be sufficient notice to tell people, the unsophisticated, what an R1 is and an R2 zone is if they complain about it. You know, that gives some people notice, but not necessarily the public. But if the notice says change the R1 to increase the density to an R2, it gives them more notice. The more detail you have, the more likely you are to have given the public notice of what's going on. But at least you have to have some detail at all in your notice. If you have the detail, you have the notice, then all you're required to do is have the doors open for the public to come in. There's nothing in the law that requires you to allow public participation in your meetings. That's a whole different body of law. There may be law, as the planners know that, where there are required public hearings. The Open Meetings Act doesn't speak to public hearings, it speaks to public meetings. So all you're required to do to comply with the Open and Public Meetings Act is let the public come in and watch you meet. That's why it's easy to comply. You don't have to let the public interrupt. You don't have to let the public disrupt. You don't even have to allow the public to participate. You have to allow the public to watch you deliberate and decide. Any questions thus far? So what a meeting is, what a public body is, what the minimum requirement of the notice is. Yes?
I do have one question. If another body convenes a meeting that more or enough of us to form a quorum attend that meeting, and it involves a discussion of ancillarily city interests, does that constitute a convened meeting?
It doesn't unless you all agree to go to that meeting together. I mean, if you just happen to, let's say the school board's holding a meeting and it has location of new high school, and you're interested in it, and you show up and you're all there as a city council, no problem. Let's say the same scenario occurs and the mayor says, I think we ought to attend so that we can show them that we're interested in this decision. Then that feels more like you've been convened, doesn't it? Now, if the mayor also says, I think we ought to attend, and then afterwards, let's meet and discuss what the school board's intending to do, then that clearly feels like a meeting and deliberation and maybe deciding. But the simple fact that 3 of you may show up at a school board meeting doesn't mean that, and that 3 is a quorum, doesn't mean that you're violating the Open Public Meetings Act. It means you've gone to somebody else's public meeting.
So you mentioned that you can convene a meeting by electronic purposes and things like that. What if, I'm going to pick on the mayor, if the mayor said, everyone read this and tell me what you think? Is that convening a meeting if he just emails it?
No, but if the mayor says, everyone read this, and at 2 o'clock we're going to get on, be available for an internet conversation of some sort about what's
Phone
going
call
on,
or something like that.
then it's clearly you've been convened, and clearly if you're getting together, you're doing it to deliberate, and perhaps you're doing it to decide.
Gotcha.
Because the idea, remember, is this: the policy of the state of Utah is we have traded efficiency for transparency. It is easier to make tough decisions if we can do it behind closed doors. But we've traded that efficiency for the transparency so that the public can buy in to the ultimate decision, or at least feel like they participated in the ultimate decision, so that we can avoid what we see every year at the state legislature, where every tough decision is really made in a caucus and then announced. We don't get to do that. They get to do that, by the way, because in the definitions of the Open Public Meetings Act, party caucuses is defined as not being a public body. That's purposeful. They define that because they want to be able to do that, because they know on their big pieces of legislation they can negotiate it better behind closed doors than negotiate it in public. But they have not given you the option to do that. There is no definition of party caucuses for you guys. There's no definition or a way that you can do the equivalent thing. So if you find yourself doing the equivalent thing that the state legislature does on tough issues, getting together in less than a public setting to decide what you're going to do, you will know that if you're not outright cheating on the Open Public Meetings Act, you're real close to it. And you'll know if you're doing that, because it's purposeful. Yes?
So I'm going to get really kind of nitpicky then for a second to make sure that I'm clear on that. In your example of the school board, let's say that you're going to meet with the school board, but it's not
yet an issue, right?
They're not convening a public meeting. They're just going to meet with a few of them. That doesn't constitute a quorum on their side. But there are 3 council members that attend that meeting, and you are going to discuss a specific issue that relates to the city.
If 3 council members are going, there's a quorum, and you've been invited because you're council members, and it's a meeting of the public body. And let me just say, there is no reason for that to happen. There's no purpose as a lawyer who represents cities that I conceive that would ever be a good idea that 3 council members would be should allow themselves to be enticed to meet with somebody in private, like the school board or a developer or a neighborhood group, to discuss what the city should do. Because the purpose of those meetings is to suck you in, to commit you to a decision outside the public purview, and get the decision done quickly and easily without the benefit of the public people, or they wouldn't invite you. Now, it would make sense for the school board to call in the city administrator, make sense for the school board to meet with the mayor, make for the, to discuss things, administrative things, executive things, to do things. It never makes sense for a developer, a neighborhood group, or school board, anybody else to say, we need a majority of the council to meet here because we got to get your buy-in. That's an invitation to cheat the public out of the transparency. Okay, we know what a quorum is for you. Council, it's clear, it's 3. Your quorum for your planning commission is set by your own ordinance and your own bylaws. Meeting outside without a quorum, 2 of you together to talk politics, to talk strategy, no problem. Mayor and 1 getting together to lecture each other, talk about what you're going to do, no problem. 2 council members meeting together. Yeah. no problem. But if you're using that as a way to cheat, to me, it's a problem. There are cities that say, look, we got tough decisions to make. I know I can't get together with the quorum and do it. So the mayor's invited two of us, one of us to come in at 1 o'clock, one of us to come in at 2 o'clock, one of us to come in at 3 o'clock, and one of us to come in at 4 o'clock. And by the end, I think we ought to have consensus. You know, these serial non-meetings. The press and the public thinks that's cheating. It feels like cheating. The purpose of doing that is to cheat. I know some of you have got to get out, so I want to finish up. Okay, the other thing the Open Public Meetings Act does that's oftentimes less important to members of the public body than it is to the staff is the Open Public Meetings Act is the body of law that says what your minutes must contain. That's important to the public on the transparency side. It says it sets a minimum requirement that's in the minutes. The best way to describe that minimum requirement is that when a member of the public body speaks in a meeting, the substance of what that member says must be included in the written minutes. Not a transcription, but the substance. And every vote of a member of the public body must be contained in the written minutes by name. It also requires that if you allow a member of the public to speak in the meeting, the minutes must contain the name, pertinent information about that person, and the substance of what they say. Now that was put in purposely by the state legislature at the behest of some people who complained that they would come to city council meetings, talk, and then when they read the minutes, all it would say is so-and-so came and talked. And they wanted what they said in the minutes. So they said specifically, if you invite someone to present or allow somebody to present, you've got to include the substance of what they've said in your minutes. The law requires that the minutes be available within a reasonable time. The regulations in that are different for the legislative body than the planning commission. For your city council, your draft minutes, at least, have to be available to the public in draft form within 30 days after the close of the meeting. For your planning commission, that's not the same rule. For once your minutes are approved for both planning commission and city councils, the minutes have to be available to the public within 3 days after they're finally approved. So in the old days, draft minutes were never given out. Now the law says as soon as the draft is available for any member of the body to review, they have to be also available for the public. You can have them stamped draft on them, but they have to be available. All your meetings are recorded, and those have to be recording from start to finish with no 18-minute gaps. And the recording is a public record, has to be available to free of charge for the public to listen to in some manner or fashion within 3 days after the meeting. It's easy to do now. It used to be hard, but now everybody got in their pocket a digital recorder that's lots better than we all used to have, and so there's no excuse as far as the legislature's concerned anymore for not being able to record your minutes and make them available, because you know, phones do that, computers do that, lots of things do that. Now, all meetings, as I said, start as an open public meetings. Some portions of open meetings can be closed for very particular and limited purposes. That's what we sometimes call executive sessions or closed meetings. The purposes for which you can close a meeting are listed specifically in the statute. That list is meant to be exclusive, not descriptive. What I mean by that is it's not those things and things like them to them. It's those things and only those things. The list has been lengthened in recent years, but none of the things they've added to it affect cities and towns. There's some things dealing with the state legislature and some ethics committees and some child protective committees that they've added. But in general, and I'm just saying this in general after I said that it's meant to be specific, I will describe what the ones that are that apply to city councils and other cities. You may close a meeting to talk about a person, their character, their competence, their mental, their physical health. Not to talk about personnel issues, not to talk about people in general, but to talk about a person. You can close a meeting to talk about strategy on pending or reasonably imminent litigation. That's been clearly interpreted by the judges who have heard these arguments to mean you have been sued, or you've at least got a notice of claim and know the name of the attorney. Many of us in the past have used that as a way to close meetings to talk about tough decisions once someone stands up and says, if you do this, I'll hire a lawyer. The threat of litigation isn't enough. It's strategy on actual litigation that allows you to close. So you're talking about strategy on pending, not how do we avoid a lawsuit? What do we do about the one we didn't avoid? Kind of idea. You can close a meeting and talk about ongoing criminal investigations. You can close a meeting and talk about strategy issues on sale or purchase of land and water rights when the strategy discussions are necessary to preserve your information you might have about appraisals or the price that you're willing to take or the price you're willing to offer to get the best deal. You may not close it to talk about the policy of should we buy or should we sell. That's a public decision. You get to close it to talk about now that we made the public decision to buy or sell, let's talk about how we negotiate the best price. You can close a meeting to talk about the deployment of security devices. Here's the code to the door, here's the code to the computer. And you can close the meeting to talk about strategy on collective bargaining. None of us in the Valley, except I think Salt Lake City right now, bargains with their employees. Now that you have a police force and you may start, because that's usually the group that likes to bargain is the FOP and their representatives, and that's good enough. But if you are in that, you could close a meeting to do that kind of thing. Other than that, that's about it for cities. You don't get to close it to talk about zoning decisions or development issues or development codes. You don't get to close it to talk about economic development or contracts. There's some limited rights to close it in the procurement kind of thing when you're dealing with evaluating RFPs and things like that, but very limited. If it's not one of those specific things, though, it's intended to be an open public discussion. You may not, in a closed meeting, approve any ordinance, resolution, or contract, or any appointment to fill a vacancy on the city council. That's sometimes expressed as you can't take a vote in a closed meeting. Well, the law does not say you can't take a vote in a closed meeting. It says you can't approve that list of things. Obviously, if you're deciding strategy on buying or selling something, or if you're deciding strategy on legislation or on litigation, there's going to be a way to make decisions in that meeting. But what you can't do is approve a contract, pass an ordinance, make an appointment in a closed meeting. In my opinion, unless you're meeting with a lawyer about some lawsuit, planning commissions should never close any part of the meetings. The list to me just doesn't seem to apply to planning commissions other than the litigation. Now maybe they're going to meet with you to say, here's the code to the front door. I keep forgetting that. All closed meetings are recorded, except those where you're talking about a person or where you're talking about the security devices. Those meetings may not be recorded if you wish not to, but you have to have an affidavit saying, I swear the only thing we talked about was that. The reason for the security devices is obvious. Why would you want a recording that has that information in for someone to find? The reason for not requiring it when you're talking about a person is because the lobbyists for people like us convinced the legislature that the very existence of a recording hinders frank discussion about those sensitive issues because everybody's afraid that someone eventually would hear what was said. All the rest are recorded. The recording is a protected document. Under grandma, that's a term of art. It means that it is not public. It means it can't be shared with anybody unless the body that creates the document agrees to make it public. That also is relevant to the ethics conversation because under the Municipal Officers and Employees Ethics Act, which we're all subject to, it is a violation of that act and perhaps a violation of criminal law depending on the reasons why you might do it for a member of a public body to share protected information inappropriately without permission. So if you're in a closed meeting and you get information and you share it without permission of the public body, you tell people what went on, you tell people what the decision, you may be violating the Ethics Act. And if you do that in such a way to further your own financial interests or the financial interests of someone else, some benefit, if it's a pocketbook issue, financial issue, it's a crime. You can go to jail for that. Now that seems easy, by the way, not to do that. But put yourself in the situation like this that comes up in communities like yours fairly often. You decide you're going to condemn a piece of property to widen a road. That decision's made publicly. And then you reach a time when there's a closed meeting and your attorney may be there and they say, we've got an appraisal, property's worth $100,000, is what the appraisal says. We've shared that appraisal with the property owner, but we're going to go negotiate with them, but we wanted to talk with you, Mr. Counsel, about our strategy on this. It will cost us $20,000 if we have to condemn. We'll have to pay an appraiser, we'll have to pay a thing. I suggest that you authorize me to go to him and offer the appraised price of $100,000, and if he doesn't take it, may I have permission to go up to $120,000? And most reasonable counsel say, yeah, if it's going to cost us $120,000, do that. So that's protected private information. But you may think to yourself, as at least one council member might think, wait a minute, I know that guy. That guy's my neighbor. I might be that neighbor's ministering brother. That neighbor's my friend. Someone ought to tell that guy, don't take the first offer. How unfair of us to not tell him that we'll go up to 120. Put yourself in those shoes. You could see how you might think. There's no harm in me whispering to him, hey, wink and a nod, come back at us with another number and you might get it. If you do that, you've breached the trust, you've forgotten who you represent, and you might have violated a law. But that's a difficult kind of thing that can occur. We decided we'd go up to 120. Someone ought to tell him, don't say yes to the 100. Okay, the Open and Public Meetings Act is enforced in two general ways. First is very rare, criminal sanctions. County attorney and the attorney generals are charged with enforcing it. It can be a misdemeanor if you purposely violate the Open and Public Meetings Act. I've never known anybody to be actually charged and convicted of it. Lots of people have been accused of it and threatened with criminal citations. Generally, it would be bodies who just intentionally say, we don't care, we're going to go meet and decide and to get caught. The other way it's enforced is civilly. People may challenge your actions that are done in violation of the Open Public Meetings Act. If a challenge is for example, the common challenge is item wasn't on the agenda properly, I didn't have notice, and they passed something that's not on the agenda. If that challenge is made within, and I'm looking here just to make sure, because I always confuse the word 60 and 90. If that challenge is made within 90 days from the action, then whatever you did may be voided. So actions you take in violation of the Open Public Meetings Act are voidable. They're not void for sure, they're voidable. If they're challenged within the 90 days, and in fact you violated the law, not on the agenda, no proper meeting called, for whatever, then it's void, and you will just have to redo it again with a proper open and public meeting. The courts have said that the remedy is not that you can't do what you wanted to do, just that you have to notice it up and do it again properly. If no challenge is made within the 90 days, then it's too late. So if you hear that and you think, oh, I know a year ago they did something I don't like, I'm going to go tell them and say it's void, it's way too late. Any questions generally about the Open Public Meetings Act from anybody? Usually at this point in time they say, what about cell phones, things like that. So I'll just answer those as if you'd asked.
What about cell phones?
It's really interesting on the cell phones. It used to be very straightforward. Could we do a conference call? Is that a violation? And everybody said, yeah, clearly a violation. You all get on a conference call together, you're meeting, you're convening. And then, of course, we started to get social media, we get cell phones, we get email, we get text messaging, we get all these ways of communicating through electronic messaging, and it got more muddy because everybody was saying you can't do that because it's a violation of the Open Public Meetings Act. You can't send a group email to everybody because that's like a conference call. You can't do that, Open Public Meetings Act. You can't send a group text. So the legislature, of course, the act applies to it as well, and the issues would come up, and of course they get confused with that. So they thought about it, and they put in the law a definition of what we would call, and I'll read this exactly because I can never remember it, what they call, why did I just go over it? Electronic message. So they have a definition. Electronic message means a communication transmitted electronically, including electronic mail, instant messaging, electronic chat, text messaging, and any other method that conveys a message or facilitates communication electronically. So that's the definition. And then they put in the act a section that says, nothing in this act shall be construed as a violation of, well, I'll get that exactly too. But it says that electronic messaging, nothing in this act should be construed to say that electronic messaging is a violation of the act, except if you do it from a public meeting. Here's the exact language. It says this: nothing in this chapter shall be construed to restrict a member of a public body from transmitting an electronic message to other members of the public body at a time when the public body is not convened in an open meeting. So, I cannot tell you it's illegal to email each other. I can't tell you that it's illegal to just group text, because it isn't. But if you're convened in an open meeting, it is. And how are you convened? If someone says, we're getting together on text at 2 o'clock, and the right person, you've been convened, and then it is. But if you just get a wild hair at work and say, I think there's a real problem with dogs running large on the west side, and send out that text, that's not a violation of the Open Public Meetings Act. But if we're sitting in this meeting like this and you start texting each other, if you're in some public hearing on zoning and everybody looks down and you start doing a text that says, I think we ought to end this now and just vote to not do something, then it's a violation.
What, just in regards to that, what if a member of the body is not present? Or does that include that member that's not present as well?
Yes. You're in a public body and texting. Let me just say, if a member's not present, why are you involving them? You can involve them electronically if you notice it up and put them on the speaker and you do all that kind of thing.
So if we happen not to be at a meeting, we shouldn't be texting each other saying, hey, this is what I think.
Yeah, you shouldn't do that if you're deliberating. You don't get to vote in absence. Now, it's also very rude, and people think it's inappropriate to receive text during the meeting from members of the public telling you what to do. I can't say that's illegal, but I can definitely tell you it's rude and people know what's going on. You know, when you see people like this and then they look down. Any questions about that? Okay, because we're short on time, let's jump right to ethics. Ethics is just as important as the Open and Public Meetings Act. As I mentioned already on the ethics thing, it meshes with the Open and Public Meetings Act in a lot of ways. Clearly, intentional violations of the Open and Public Meetings Act are unethical. The Open and Public, the Ethics Act does two things. It creates a body of criminal laws that you can, criminal violations that you can now commit that you couldn't have committed before you took this job. So members of the Planning Commission, by volunteering to be on the Planning Commission, by volunteering to run for office, you are now subject to potential criminal sanctions that the public is not subject to. Now, it's very hard to commit those crimes. but there are crimes that are committed. Now, these crimes are generally this: you may not use your position to obtain special privileges for yourself or others. So, if you're on the city council and you get pulled over by the Draper City Police for speeding, and you say to them just offhandedly, boy, you're doing a good job. Those of us on the city council are proud of the way you serve. And that police officer says, and we're happy to have the jobs. Here's a warning instead of a ticket, Mr. Councilman. That may be a crime.
Only the Drapers.
If you attempt to use your official position to get a special privilege, and what special privilege is something not available to other members of the public that you're, you know, it's not your wage, it's not your salary, it's not your thing, it's a special privilege. If you attempt to use that, your position to get that, it's a violation of the Ethics Act. It's a violation of the Ethics Act and may be a crime if you use information that you've obtained that is private, protected, or controlled by virtue of your office, and disclose that information for the benefit of yourself or others. The story that I told before about telling somebody about the protected information in the meeting. It's a violation of the Ethics Act to accept, other than campaign donations and gifts that are worth less than $50, to accept anything that is given to you as a reward for doing your duty, other than, you know, your salary, or to motivate you to do some way. In other words, you can't line your own pocket or sell your vote. So you need to be careful about some things. You know, project comes in, planning commission, developer, you know, subdivision, and you're looking at it and you think, wow, this is a great idea. And the developer says, I hope you think so. And you say, yes, you certainly got my support. And by the way, could you hold the lot on the end? Because I'd really like to look at that and maybe build a house. Now, you may have already been going to vote for them. You may be offhanded. You may be just, you know, in your own private little thing making a comment. That person who's before you is going to think, yeah, you know, they're holding me up. They're asking for something to get my vote. And they may just mean it as kind of an offhand comment. And if the public overhears it, they'll definitely think that you're selling your vote. It's hard to, you get offered a lot of gifts. The $50 has been that way for 40 years. It's not much anymore. So developer inviting you for a lunch that costs more than $50 because they want to talk to you about the development would be seen as receiving something of value in order to influence you in your vote or reward you for a vote. Public, member of the public, want to take you out to lunch for the same thing. Could be seen as that. If there's an ongoing hot issue and someone wants to take you to the Jazz game to discuss it, you know, clearly you can be seen that it might be violating the Ethics Act by somebody. That's the criminal side of the Ethics Act. It's easy to comply with. You just remember, if it's not a public award, if it's not a campaign donation, don't take it. If it's a campaign donation, it goes in the campaign donation fund and you treat it like that. You don't ask people, you don't use your position to get an advantage that the general public doesn't get when you deal with people in the city. If someone wants to, if the businesses want to give you freebies because you're on the council, you say no thank you. It's just that easy. The other side of the Ethics Act is disclosure of conflicts of interest. This is the easiest thing in the world to comply with, the Utah Municipal Officers and Employees Ethics Act. It's easy to comply with because the presumption is, similar to the Open and Public Meetings Act, is that transparency cures everything. It's the bleach that cleans. So all you're required to do under the Ethics Act is, if you have a business or own an interest in a business that is regulated by your community, you have to disclose that. If you have a business that is doing business with the community, you have to disclose that. And by you, I mean you, your family, your kids, your wife. If you have another personal interest that comes in conflict with your public duties, you have to disclose that. Oh, I see, that's my nephew who's making this application for this particular permit. I ought to disclose it. All you're required to do is disclose. The law does not require you to recuse yourself. It doesn't require you not to participate. That's up to you. Now, some cities have adopted tougher ethics ordinances than the state law, and I don't know if Herriman has or not. But without that tougher ethics ordinance, to comply with the state law, all you need to do is let everybody know, I have a conflict of interest. I care deeply about this because my interest is this. And by the way, I care so much I'm going to vote no and try to stop me. You know, you can do that. Or you can say, I have a conflict of interest. I can feel it interfering with my public duties. I think my ethical standards are, I'm going to step out of the room. That'll be up to you. The law requires disclosure with the idea, as I said, that transparency is the bleach that takes the taint off it. Any questions about that? One of the most important things anymore is how the Ethics Act is enforced. It used to be enforced very ad hoc and kind of in a way that didn't provide anybody due process and provided people with the opportunity to inappropriately beat up on their political rivals. And so the legislature said, look, they heard the horror stories and they said, all right, we're going to create a public ethics commission. Now, cities, if they want, can have their own ethics commission, but if they don't have one, we have the state public ethics commission. If someone is accused of violating the Ethics Act, the complaint should go to the Ethics Commission. The Ethics Commission, in private, investigates that complaint, giving the person that's complained about appropriate due process, the chance to respond, and then if the commission finds the ethical violation, they take or recommend the appropriate sanction, and if they don't find it, they report back saying there is no ethical violation here. That way we avoid these nasty things that have happened in other cities where someone makes a public accusation saying, this guy violated the Ethics Act, he has a conflict of interest, she has a money interest in this, I'm accusing you, and the person then sitting there in the public saying, no, no, and of course the public believes whatever they hear loudly enough, and the person never gets a fair hearing. So in my mind, it's completely inappropriate if you feel somebody's acting unethical or violating the Ethics Act in some way, to not follow the appropriate steps and run it through either your own local ethics commission or the state ethics commission. I tell people I think it's if they care enough to accuse their good friend publicly about being unethical, perhaps they've got too much of a conflict of interest themselves if you're going to go that far. But that's the way it's intended to be enforced. There are criminal sanctions for the criminal violations that are enforced by obviously county attorneys and attorney generals sometimes bring charges. You saw that Provo case that went on for years and years against that council member. I can't even remember how the court case came out. But it's a good example of how mean this can be. Members of the public and other members on the city council accused a person that I thought was a very nice person, always very friendly to me, accused the council member of violating the Ethics Act, having conflicts of interest, voting for his own pocketbook, doing favors for developers. And it was a very public accusation in all the newspapers and everything, eventually investigated, eventually charged by the county attorney, and eventually tried. But it was mean right from the first charge. It would have been cleaner if accusations were made, Ethics Commission investigates, Ethics Commission reports, and then if the Ethics Commission finds it, the criminal sanctions and that could follow. They would have avoided a lot of nastiness early on. Any questions about the Ethics Act?
I just want to make sure that we're covering all lines, because I feel like we're rushing you, because of those countries like accounts that fell up and we're recording it. Sherry's not here, and so when she comes back, she just
I'm not rushing. I'm efficient. I'm just not telling all the stories I normally tell. Now,
the stories make them really good. They're true stories.
I could tell they're semi-true because I've edited them. True stories are never as good as the rest of them.
You know, I always have questions on ethicals. You've been very clear on the workers should come in, but ethics ethics about the role between council and planning commission role, negotiations.
And those are very good questions, especially for the council and planning commission. On the land use things, because these are hot issues in all our high growth communities, these are very important things. How you handle the open meetings and the ethics is very important on the land use side of it in a couple of respects. First is, and it's colored by this, a city council member, a city council could have 3 distinct roles in any land use kind of issue. They could be acting, and this is true in part to the planning commission as well, so I should include them. You can be acting in a legislative fashion. Planning commission's role in legislation is they make recommendations on ordinances, zone changes, legislative matters. That's a legislative function. City council acts as the legislative body and adopts laws, ordinances, general plans. And in the land use arena, we do legislate. We legislate when we adopt general plans and when we adopt ordinances, including zoning ordinances and zoning maps. Those are legislative decisions, they're political decisions. The other role that we have is administrative decisions. Once the legislation is done, someone has to act as the land use authority, someone makes recommendations to the land use authority. That's purely an administrative function. When you approve subdivisions, when you approve conditional use permits, when you approve site plans, when you review those kind of things, that's an administrative function. That's a completely different kind of function, has different ethical considerations, different laws applied to it, and is treated differently even in the open public meetings kind of sphere. The third thing that you might be involved in is you could be acting as in a quasi-judicial capacity. We're required in the land use thing to have an appeal authority. Now, I happen to be your appeal authority on some things, but there are matters in your ordinances that perhaps, I don't know if they still are, that where something could be decided by somebody and then appealed to a planning commission or appealed to a city council. Most of your things, I think, are appealed to the land use authority. But those 3 functions exist in the land use arena. You have to keep in mind, whether you're a planning commissioner or city council, the differences between those 3 functions, especially when it comes to the ethics side of the equation. When you're acting as a legislator, the required legislative process for a zone change, for a adoption of a general plan or amendment to a general plan or adoption of subdivision is that the state law requires that the planning commission make a recommendation to the city council before the city council considers that. Now, the purpose for that, to me, is interesting. It's historical, the purpose. The idea is that years ago, when we were given the power to control property, to zone, the idea was, look, elected people are subject to the political whims of the voters. They're afraid of losing elections. Land use control is government control of people's private property. If we are going to allow local government to control the use of people's property, we're not going to allow the politicians to be completely in charge of that. So we are going to require, as a condition of giving you this zoning authority, giving you land use control, that you have a planning commission. And the intent of the planning commission was that these would be non-politicians, that they'd be planning experts, that they would take the politics out of the decision-making to some extent. So the idea behind the legislation and our legislative function is, when we are doing zone changes or legislating, supposedly experts, planners, planning commission are first advising the politicians and making recommendations. When you're dealing in a legislative capacity as a council member, if you try to usurp that planning thing, you're going to make the public and the developers mad. They're going to be suspicious, and you're not going to get as good of planning decisions. So I always advise the council members the legislators. You don't go to those planning commission hearings on that, because the idea is they're to make a recommendation to you. You're not to guide their recommendation by telling them what you want, because you as politicians are getting the last say. You get to make the laws no matter what their recommendations are. But the system is supposedly non-political, independent, educated planners first make a recommendation to you before you make that decision. So don't, the best practices is you don't usurp that process, because it takes the public trust out of the planning decision. It also, you get accused by the developers of cooking the books before they get a fair shot. Yes?
Just one quick question. You said we shouldn't attend those meetings at all, or we shouldn't?
I wouldn't attend. If I was on a council, I wouldn't attend. Because why? You can listen to them if you want. But if you attend, then the temptation is for some council members to say, or commissioners to say, you know, why are we doing all this? Let's ask the council if they're even going to like this, you know, or else the temptation is that the public who's there at the public hearings says, well, where do you stand on it? And the answer should be, I don't know where I stand until the public process is done and we get a recommendation from our expert planners. Now, planning commissioners, where the fault is I'm not ascribing this as fault, I'm saying where the developers and the others see the fault is that our planning commissions in some communities, and I don't know if yours is this way or not, but in some communities, planning commissioners see themselves as the equivalent of members of the community council. Like they're there to protect the neighbors from the city council and the developers. That's a different role. If you see yourself with that, you're in the wrong seat. Planning commissioners should educate themselves on planning processes, good planning, what good planning is, and the idea behind it is we're not there to represent the neighbors, we're there to represent good planning ideas. The city council's there to represent the neighbors. The city council there on the legislative side is there to be the politicians. The planning commissioner is there to say, you know, best planning, best practices, regardless of what the neighborhood might think, or regardless of what the newspapers might think, or regardless of what the development might think, best planning, best practices, the planning commission says for this area is this. Now politicians, do with it what you will. And that's why the courts have said on the legislative side, public clamor is appropriate for the council members to hear, because it's a legislative decision. It's not appropriate for the planning commission necessarily to consider that. You know, you're going to get public clamor. Your role is to be an expert. And that's why at least when people ask me, they say, well, you know, I think it's wrong. There's a developer on the planning commission. I'd say, well, I hope so. Somebody ought to be there to give that view. Or say, I think it's wrong. The people on the planning commission is a banker. Well, I hope that we got that expertise somewhere. I think it's wrong. The people on the planning commission are anti-growth. Well, yeah, I hope we have somebody there who's speaking for that kind of thing. But your idea is to have a commission that can be experts and be a resource for the legislators. So then when it gets to the legislators, you've got a recommendation from the planners that is a real recommendation, not political, not cooked in advance, you know, not guided by you, and you get to then say, all right, I'm elected to represent the people. I know what they think. I'm a politician, but I also know what the good planning is. I'm now going to make a decision. And that's why I advise avoid trying to guide the planning commission in advance, because then people say, well, we didn't get a fair shot in front of the city council. They'd already made up their mind. I heard them in the planning commission. The planning process was usurped by the mayor and city council, who all showed up and sat on the back row and said, you better not do this. You know, that kind of thing. And I'm not sure you do that at all, but in other places it's happened. On the administrative side, when you're handing out permits, there's no role for public clamor. Doesn't matter what the public thinks. All that matters is, does the application meet the ordinances? When you're passing the ordinances, it matters what the public thinks. when you're handing out permits, the only question is, does it meet the code? And so in that case, the ethics are completely different. You have an ethical obligation as planning, if the planning commission is in charge of handing out a certain permit, approving a conditional use permit or a site plan or that, your ethical obligation is to, the state law says, if it meets the ordinances, you must approve. The requirement is, does it meet the ordinances? Let's look at how it does or how it doesn't. I often tell planning commissioners, when it comes to the administrative side, is your job is to tell the landowner what the rules are to accomplish what the landowner wants to do. It's not to tell the landowner that's a stupid idea, or you can if you want, or not to tell the landowner, no, you can't do it. It is to say, if you want to do this, these are the rules. If you meet these rules, we will say yes. If you don't meet these rules, we have to say no. And that way it gets easy. Now, I don't think the city council acts very often in Herriman on administrative things. Do you guys see subdivisions? So that doesn't come up much. But the ethics on the handing out permits is very straightforward. If you feel like you can't say yes when the law requires you to say yes, then somebody else ought to be sitting on the commission. Because we get to write the rules in advance. It's our advantage. And we can write them whatever we want. But once they're written, we're stuck with them. Now, you're not involved in the ex officio thing, so I won't even talk about it. But if you are involved in hearing things, it's a whole different set of rules. You got to be impartial. You can't. You're supposed to be independent. You got to hear both sides of the issue. You have to give people due process. Due process is a kind of an important concept, even in the legislative side and administrative side. People are entitled under the state code to get very specific notices of very specific things. And so if there's something where you're going to downzone somebody's property and you can identify that property owner, very specific notices are now required by the state code to the property owner. Very specific notices are required in your own ordinances to the neighbors. And they're entitled under the state code, as I mentioned before, to that process, that idea that the planners will make a recommendation that then the city council can either ignore or accept. And the idea that the planners will educate themselves and become experts in the planning process to give people a fair recommendation on these kind of zone things, not a political recommendation. Any questions about that? Any other sundry things, as it says or anything, that you want to discuss? Social media is a very tough issue anymore. Let me just tell you that there are some best practices on social media in my mind. I don't participate in social media at all, so forgive me if I misspeak about how things are done. I've never been on Facebook. I've never seen a Facebook page. I've never read a tweet. I'm too dumb. I don't know the difference between Snapchat and Google, frankly. But I can tell you this: you post something, a comment, as a council member with your name and say, I'm the Herriman City Council and this is what I think, whether it's on a private or a public page, whether by public I mean city-owned or your own, and you identify yourself, you own that. And it may come back to haunt you. It may hurt the city, but it may hurt you individually if you do harm with that, and you may not be able to be protected. I was involved in a fairly recent case with the city I represent where a man runs for mayor. Running for mayor because he's against the big development on the hill. Is very vocal about the development on the hill. Says some things about the development as an individual that the developer thinks are being said purely out of spite because they've had a long time relationship that was acrimonious and that are untrue. So he alleges that in this campaign, he was putting them in false light, defaming the development. Guy gets elected mayor. Between the period of time he's mayor, he gets elected and takes office, he of course then starts to prepare for his office, continues to say things like, we're going to stop that development on the hill. It's a bad development. It's unsafe. Becomes mayor, continues to personally post an email on the community Facebook page about how we're going to stop this, and now that I'm mayor and we got the bad guys out and this is a bad thing on the hill. And now, as mayor, puts the same things in the official newsline and on the official website. So we go from obviously private campaign comments on the local public website, you know, the We Are Us or the anti-Save Our Hills or all that, you know, and post them, I'm the candidate to vote for, to his own afterwards, mayor-elect, I'm the candidate, and he posts those with his name, to then mayor, and then he posts them as mayor. Well, the city gets sued, various things, and part of the suit is we have been, as individuals, defamed by this man. We have been put in false light. Our development has been defamed. It's now worth less. The lots, we have to clear up this misunderstanding to get the money out of our lots that we want. And the things are untrue. This goes to trial, along with other claims against the city. The jury finds that these comments were untrue, made for personal gain and in bad faith, and had placed him in false light, and that poor individual mayor gets hit with, I think it was $100,000 of damages, and punitive damages of $100,000. The city, for the part that he did when he's mayor, gets hit with damages for putting him in false light. But he had to own what he put on those things under his own name while he's mayor-elect, and what he put on when he was a campaign and got hit for. And of course, the city's insurance company covers the city. It doesn't cover him. He's on his own on his insurance, because city may be covered, but he's not being covered for his intentional bad acts, and especially when he's not mayor. That's the risk you run with active social media campaigns on hot issues. When you post a lot of things with your name, when you say what you say, you've got to be careful, because that stuff is read, and sometimes it's hurtful, and if it turns out to be untrue, you may suffer personal consequences that we can't protect you from. Now, when you do the same thing as a council member in a public meeting, if this guy had limited his comments to, I'm mayor of this city, I'm sitting on this dais in this council room, and by the way, as mayor, I hold these views. The law protects him. You know, he's got legislative immunity. It's part of the legislative process. He's got governmental immunity. It's only when he stepped outside that role, either pre-office or acting as an individual, not mayor or campaign, and on the private social media, his own emails, his own Twitter, that he put himself at risk and finally lost. And that's why I advise best practices is for you guys who are in the public eye, that to not act like you were when you were a community activist and can post everything. Your name's on it. You'll be heard as a council member or as a commissioner. You'll be seen as speaking for the community and not yourself. And what you say, like they say, the internet is printed in ink. It doesn't go away. And people beat you up with it later, and you can do harm. So I advise people to, you want to communicate with your community, you want to use social media, you want to do all that stuff, avoid the contentious, unofficial, personal, private Facebook pages where you discuss particular people, particular businesses, particular developments by name, unless you're relatively sure what you're saying is truthful and not harmful. You know, I know we've got the big development out here on the west that everybody's worried about, you know that. And we see in the newspaper the names of the developers. If you post something that says, this guy has done bad developments all over the valley and you can't trust what he says, that's completely different than posting saying, this development is a bad idea. Can you see the difference? But the temptation is to do the first, the former, to identify. We can't trust what this man says when he stands up in a meeting because I heard what he did in Sandy was terrible. You do that, you might find yourself getting a letter from that man's attorney saying that's different than saying this proposal is not a good proposal. And that's why I would avoid those kind of things, especially personalizing it, names, the private kind of discussion boards and that where it gets heated, the back and forth, try to avoid, because it's easy to step over the line without realizing it. The mayor I was talking about is a very nice guy. He didn't think he was doing anything wrong. He honestly believed this subdivision was a bad idea, that these lots were dangerous, that people shouldn't buy them, that the hillside was going to slide, that the floods were going to come. And of course, all the engineers said they're safe. All the planners said it was all right, but he believed something else. And when you say the lot this guy's trying to sell is a dangerous lot subject to flooding, you change the value of that lot.
So if there's a mudslide or flood later, does he get his $100,000?
Well, it turns out to be right, but he won't because the jury already said that. But that's the kind of thing on social media I'm very, very careful of. The other thing to be careful is, of course, the danger of on the open meetings thing. You all get on those. You will know if you're cheating the Open Meetings Act. You will know if you're taking action outside the meeting. You will know if you're deliberating outside the meeting. You will. It takes effort to cheat. I mean, if I know that every city council I've ever been to, you end the meeting, the public goes home, and then you have the after meeting. Those people know that in that after meeting, if they're deliberating or deciding, that they're cheating. There's a reason why those discussions didn't take place when the public was there.
So nobody should complain that I run out of here the second meeting.
Yeah, but so don't cheat. Any other questions? Sorry I didn't have a PowerPoint, I'm too old. And I'm sorry I didn't have handouts because I'm too lazy.
I do want to say this, if you get around David Churchburg, he actually advised you to utilize the balance. So when you know those conversations, when he's on the agenda, he packs it in. People listening for 3 hours.
He's
representing cities in lawsuits, and he has real stories, real effects.
What he's saying is I can be better than this at times, and he's sorry that I wasn't this time.
That's why I said it's for the entertainment.
Yeah.
He's highly valuable. He comes to us as representative, and he's always city council. That's why he's here tonight. To make sure we go to our open meetings, our training event. So.
Yes, sir. The boss wants to speak.
So David, of course it's interesting that a planning commission member should not, cannot have ex parte contact. But a city council member can have.
On the legislative matter.
Yes. So do you have any guidelines for when a legislator is being approached by a developer or a legislative matter?
I have some very straightforward guidelines.
Okay.
Is this. First off, you never take anything from them, like even a meal. If they want to approach you, they want to buy you lunch, they want to take you someplace to do it, you don't do that. Second, I think that if you are going to take calls and that from the neighbors, it's rude to say that you won't take calls from the landowner or the landowner's representative. And so I don't have any problem with that. But all contacts should be openly disclosed to everybody else, and the conversations that you had should be part of the public, transparent record. So if in fact you're going to meet with a neighborhood group or development group as an individual council member, when the issue comes up in the meeting, you should be prepared to say, by the way, the rest of you, I took the time to meet with this individual, this group, and he shared some information with me. I certainly hope the rest of you get an opportunity to share the same, and you can say it didn't color my decision or it did, but that ought to be open and transparent. But as elected politicians, it's impossible for you to say to somebody, when the legislative matter comes in front of you that I refuse to talk to the public about this because I have to vote on it. No one accepts that. The public doesn't, and the landowner doesn't. They think, inappropriate lobbying is when you take money from them, or gifts from them, or ask for favors from them, or where you try to keep it secret that you're doing it. That's when you get in trouble. Now, if you can't keep it, if you don't want to discuss it, and you don't want to do it, it's also all right to say, this is coming in front of us. I'm going to get a planning commission's recommendation. I think I understand your thing. I just as soon not meet with you. I can see he wants to ask a question right there. He almost said it.
You also mentioned, citizen groups too.
Same, yeah, I think citizens groups ought to be treated just like developers. They're not the public, they're citizens groups. People organize themselves into groups, Some people have an interest in selling ground and making money, and other people have an interest in keeping the farm and the open space. Everybody's equal in my mind when it comes to receiving information. Now, to the politicians, not everyone's equal. Voters count more than non-voters. But if you're going to meet with citizens groups and then say, I'm going to meet with the Save Our Canyons, but I'm not going to meet with the Plow Up the Fields group. That just, people get mad at you. And there are people that, by the way, very often get elected to the state legislature later and tell stories about us and then take away our power. One of the reasons why the laws are written the way it is the legislature thinks that we can't be trusted to make good land use decisions. So every time they meet, there's new proposals where they want to limit local government's authority to make these decisions. And a lot of that is because they say, we don't get a fair hearing in front of these groups. They listen to the neighborhood, but never listen to us. In fact, there have been proposals every year to take planning, zoning decisions out of the locals and do it regional. There was a proposal being run a few years ago, say, we'll turn it over to the AOGs. We'll let the Wasatch Front Regional Council do zoning for all of the Salt Lake Valley. That way we can spread out the affordable housing. We won't have the NIMBY. We won't have referendum, because a referendum countywide is less likely to pass than a referendum in Herriman when it's a Herriman issue. If you make the decision at the county level, it'll happen. Yeah. So.
You're touching on some sore spots there.
No, I'm just saying that that's the kind of proposals going on because of the way the referendums run, and that the developers are saying, well, how do we avoid that? We can avoid it by, let's just make this a statewide decision. People in Garfield County don't care what development's going in Herriman. We'll give them a vote on it.
Yeah, there's some states have already adopted those rules. Yep. Oregon's got one that this year to adopt a law that they take over the zoning.
And the reason why they do that is because they tell this story to the legislature that we do not get a fair shake in the cities. The planning commissions are not planners. They're neighborhood activists. The city councils are afraid of the voters, and we don't get good decisions made. And so they tell that story. And I think the Speaker of the House is still Brad Wilson, isn't he? Brad Wilson owns Destination Homes. He's in the business. He believes those stories. Is Adam still the President of the Senate? Mm-hmm. He's a apartment builder by profession. I mean, those guys believe these stories. And so when the bills go up there, Schultz, who's a thing, is an apartment builder. They believe that we're not giving them a fair shake because, just as you said, we will listen to a neighborhood group and won't listen to them. Now, that's why I advocate you listen to everybody, you let everybody know you've heard both sides, and then you make the best decision possible, that the Planning Commission acts like planning experts and not community activists, and the City Council act like politicians and listen to everybody and then vote so you can get reelected. But planning commissioners shouldn't vote like they want to run for office.
I was just going to say, it's not a common question at all, but as I've been dealing recently with some county, looking at stuff in the county,
yeah,
hats off to our city. for the way we notice stuff.
Yeah.
So I would just shout out to the staff right now. I know they've been getting beat up a lot lately by our staff. I mean, we're 7 days out on notices. The minutes are, you guys just looked at the minutes from the Salt Lake County meeting, not to throw anybody, but it said, oh, these residents have concern about a certain matter.
Yeah, no
And it
substance.
just listed, or in our minutes, it's listed.
Now, the law does allow them to do that if they put a link to the recording.
Right, and I'm
Where
not.
you can click
right,
on
I'm
it
not
so you
being
can
curt.
listen
I'm just
to it.
saying, hats off to our city for the way.
No.
Our packets as a.
And you deal with the county on that big county issue, and that you can see how the lack of transparency, hurts the county on it, hurt them before. It's like, wait a minute, when was this discussed? Apparently, when we weren't invited. Because they show up and things seem to have already been decided. You want to know, I want to at least be in the room to watch you decide. Now, maybe it's because we missed the notices, maybe it's because we didn't get the notices, that kind of thing. But anyway.
Mine wasn't to be critical, it was to say hats off to our city. Our city is fantastic.
Yeah, your city does a real good job. I remember when it wasn't a city, when what we used to call it is not Riverton. No, I was the Riverton City. I was the Riverton City Attorney from 1980 till 2000 or whatever it is. I mean, I know the motivation of Mayor Crane and the boys to incorporate you was because they didn't want us to successfully annex those Riverton folks. They came within 5 signatures. They came within 5 signatures of Riverton being clear out to here. On the property thing. I was involved in that Board of Adjustment appeal, and we were down counting signatures, and I was the one for Riverton City that told not Board of Adjustment, the Board of Boundary Commission for the city. I can't remember, it was 87 or something or like that. Came down to where we're counting votes, and us in the end at Riverton saying, oh, yeah, you're right, we're 5 names short. But for 5 old farmers signing it, you guys wouldn't be sitting in this. You'd be down at the Riverton City Council. Not that the buildings wouldn't still be here, all that.
All right, here's old farmers.
But you guys are a wonderful group. You've got a good staff. You've got good attorneys. You've had a run of excellent elected officials. You're not embarrassing the state, like some are. Not embarrassing the cities. I'm proud to be here. So thank you for the invitation. It's good to see you again. As I told Brett, anytime any of you want to call me for any reason with any question, feel free, as long as it's not to second guess John's legal advice. Because if you call up and say, our city attorney said this, I don't think he's right, I'm going to say, well, before you even finish, I'm going to say, well, I do. Because that's not my role. He's your attorney and I'm not.
I tell you this, over the 20 years I've known David Church, and he's never heard to an attorney, he's always taking a phone call. It blows my mind, how many people he represents throughout the state now, and nothing happened.
Well, I take a lot of phone calls, but it's not doing any good. Today I got a phone call from Wellington, where they wanted to second guess their city attorney. I got a call from New Harmony, where they wanted to second guess what somebody else had told them. And let's see, I'm trying to think. I was in a deposition all day, so I didn't answer any of these. I'm just looking at the messages. Got a phone call from a council member from Alta that wanted to talk about this person thought their city town attorney had told them it was wrong.
All at once and say your city.
No, that's what I do, and I don't mind the calls. So, thank you for the invite. Call anytime, as I say. Just don't call to second guess John. Brett, that's a different thing. But attorneys are mean.
David, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
David.
you very much.
Thank you.
See you again.
Move to adjourn.
All right,
Move to adjourn.
David, move to adjourn. Real quick, just future meeting, planning commission meeting, week from tomorrow, and then city council 2 weeks from today. Move to adjourn. All in favor?
Second.
Second, excuse me, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
See, that's how it's done.
That's right, see?
3 separate options.
I'm slow on the pickup. It happens.
Parking tickets, speeding tickets.
All right, so.